It is all starting to come together. Final weeks of August coming up here, and I mean, students are heading to campuses across the country over the last couple of weeks. Um, College basketball is starting to inch closer every day. College football is starting up this weekend, and next weekend is really when it all gets going. But you're starting to feel that little fall vibes with football talk, and that just means more basketball talk for me. And so, Brad, I'm pretty excited to get into these teams today that we've planned.
Absolutely. We have two very kind of teams with a wide range of perception and opinions on them with the Maryland and Syracuse. As you know, the more that we do these kind of deep dives, the more I just want the season to come. Every bit of research we do, just my need for regular season basketballs just increases even more.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching like the Duke trip to Canada, and it just wasn't as fulfilling for me as watching Kentucky because Kentucky, you saw them play against a much higher level of athlete. These Canadian teams are very well coached, but the three teams they played are all probably of like the level of a D2 program in the United States. So it was really hard for me to take anything away from it, even though draft Twitter was really all over Zion and RJ Barrett, like watching the moves they made. And I was like, dude, these are like guys RJ played in high school would be worse than this. RJ played at Montverde. Like he's played at much higher levels. I don't really know why we're taking too much from these games, especially with no Trey Jones and no Cam Reddish. But it was basketball, so I watched it.
Yeah, that was the biggest thing for me was like I don't mind like watching Duke pound teams, but I wish that they would have their full complement of guys to do it. Like they didn't have three of their top six guys, with Reddish, Jones, and then Alex O'Connell like broke an orbital bone in his face like 2 minutes into the first game. So like when you're watching, Barrett and Zion, and then surrounding them with guys who are gonna maybe play 5 to 10 minutes a game at the very most, it just kind of felt like it was a little cheap. Like it felt like it wasn't like real basketball. Whereas Kentucky, you had the full roster, and you mentioned they were playing better teams. So, well, I mean, Kentucky didn't even have the full roster, but they at least had like their top like 7 or 8 guys there.
Right. They had like a legit rotation to use. I mean, Duke started. I think like Antonio Vrankovic started a game. Jordan Goldwire and Jack White were playing like huge minutes, even though like they probably won't play that much during the season, if at all. My biggest takeaway was like Marcus Bolden didn't play that much. And I was like, Marcus Bolden probably should have transferred because Marcus Bolden, I think, keeps getting told by Coach K he's going to play and then just never gets played by Coach K.
He needs to wake up because I think it was the first game. He had like a wide open dunk and he was like kind of a step slow. He got it blocked. I mean, he looks kind of out of it. And then they went to that Vrankovic guy who is horrible. I mean, he's slow. He can't finish. He's a mess. But Goldwire and White, I think, are both like serviceable like role players. I think Goldwire is probably like the 8th or 9th man, and White's probably 7 or 8. So maybe they play a little bit, but yeah, definitely not like starters.
I love Jordan Goldwire. I mean, he was the guy who went from East. He was going to commit to Eastern Kentucky, and then Duke called him and wanted him to like sign late and just be like their backup point guard for 4 years and like sit at the end of the bench and like occasionally help, and like maybe by his senior year be like a junior and senior year be like a legit rotation player. He was he had like some high major interest early and then like backed off and like had like a good mid major group. Like Eastern Kentucky was in there. Mercer. I know like Siena sent him a late offer, which is why I was like following him pretty closely when Goldwire did wind up committing to Duke. I still remember like I got a text. It was like Jordan Goldwire just popped to Duke. I was like, Duke? Like the Duke that we watch? I mean, wasn't he gonna go to like Siena or Eastern Kentucky? And then sure enough. So rooting for that guy. Good dude. But got some recruiting news to touch on, Brad, as well before we get into these deep dives. Terrence Shannon backs off his DePaul commitment and reopens the process. Sure, they were seeing flashbacks of Tiger Campbell. I know he says he's still considering DePaul. I'm just going to put it out there. It never looks good when you decommit after. It just doesn't look good for your chances that he'll sign there again.
No, I think maybe like 20 to 25% of the time a player will recommit. But when it's a program like DePaul, I mean, you mentioned they got hit with the Tiger Campbell decommitment. A few years ago, they also got hit with a Shane Larkin decommitment, or like some sort of situation where he was signed or whatever, and then he ended up obviously going to Miami. Tough loss for DePaul. I mean, top 70, top 60 recruit. You're not going to find another, player like that growing on trees. That's a rare, rare pickup for a program like DePaul. They do have Romeo Weems and Darius Hall there at the 3 and the 4. And then they have, I know that the staff, I guess, likes Paul Reed a lot, who would have been a junior, at the 4 as well. So they have some options there. Just in terms of improving their overall talent level, this is a tough blow.
Yeah, that was the biggest thing. Was it's just they really needed Shannon, and not only what Shannon meant in terms of landing a top 150 recruit, landing a top 75 recruit in Shannon's case, but to land one from Mac Irvin Fire in Chicago and keep him in state when Illinois really wanted him. And that's a major step for Dave Lato's program to land a guy like that, and for him to not follow through with that commitment really stinks for Dave Lato. I mean, certainly his job security now comes more into question. I think a lot of people thought Shannon plus Romeo Weems was guaranteed job safety. I think it's still probably fine with Weems, but at this point, would we be surprised if Weems backs off his commitment at some point or doesn't sign for any reason? I don't think we should be any more. We should be all that surprised if that occurs, just because that's kind of what's happened with DePaul the last few times they've landed higher level recruits. And they have Flynn Cameron coming in this year. It could be like the point guard of the future, like a fringe top 150 recruit. But it was just a momentum killer after finally things started to be looking up.
Speaking about another pair of decommitments, so Jaquan Walton committed to Mississippi State. We talked about last time his mother made the very, very transparent statement saying that she basically made him go to Mississippi State. He didn't want to go. He's flipped down to Georgia. And then a few hours later, Georgia gets a commitment from Kyle Sturdivant, who's a top 150 player. He's a point guard, also considered like Ohio State, a few other schools. He commits and then reopens his commitment by the morning, like not even sure it was 12 hours.
It was not 12 hours. He committed at like midnight, and by 10 a.m. he was back on the board.
So Kevin, what are your thoughts on these pair of decommitments and recommitments from Georgia?
I mean, the Walton pickup is massive for Tom Crean, and Sturdivant still appears to be in a good shape for Crean at Georgia. I don't know that he will commit necessarily, but at least what we've seen out of his camp and out of some reports sounds like Georgia still has a very good shot with him. And I mean, it's very impressive the job that Crean has done with this early 2019 group. We all knew he could recruit, but I did have some concerns just reading some things about the staff he put together and hearing some things about how tough it is to recruit down south. Would Tom Crean be able to keep kids in state and keep kids in the region when there's so much competition for top 150 recruits down there? I know there was a lot of talk like they have to get Jonas Hayes for their staff or another like elite Georgia recruiter who would keep kids in state. And now obviously he got a lot of heat for not getting a guy like that on his staff, but just proving he can recruit once again. And Sturdivant would be certainly a nice second piece of this class if they can build on what they already have with Jaquan Walton. And
then Georgia has such a long and athletic lineup now. You look at Tayshawn Hightower being like the point guard of the future. He's going to be a sophomore this year. He's like 6'4". And you have Walton is like 6'6" on the wing. Then you have Rayshawn Hammonds and Nick Claxton, who are these long athletic kind of combo-y kind of 3-4s. And they have a top 100 center coming in, Amanzi Ngumzi. Excuse the pronunciation there. But in terms of this recruiting class, if they can get one center and then either a 4/5 or another 3/4, this is a really nice core that Tom Crean has put in place here.
Yeah, I think he's doing a pretty good job overall. I mean, he's the perfect really coach for a program like Georgia where it's tough to get players. Like a Marquette was kind of a similar way where at Indiana, being able to be a high-level recruiter but not necessarily a high-level game coach doesn't really move the needle because anyone who can coach at Indiana can get players. Archie Miller can get players. The guy who comes after Archie Miller will get players. Tom Crean at a level like Marquette or a level like Georgia can land these recruits that are maybe a little bit above the level that they're used to, and then maybe his in-game coaching doesn't move the needle, but it's enough to which you build a consistent winner. And he did a good job at Indiana. I mean, he wasn't an abject failure. Didn't necessarily reach the heights that Indiana had hoped, but I think he'll do a better job. I think my grade was a little low. I don't remember what I gave him. I think I gave him like a B or a B plus. I think he'll do a darn good job at Georgia based on these early 2019 returns.
Yep, and then so now moving into maybe the first big injury of the summer in terms of like a season-ending injury. Just off the top of my head, Jake Lindsey is out for the season for Baylor. He was a kind of a starter / like very important reserve glue guy. Could play 1 through 3. Good defender, handled the ball. Just like a really solid decision maker. Could shoot a little bit. So that's a pretty big loss. He was going to be a senior this year for Baylor, but they get Jared Butler, who was signed to play for Alabama or committed to play for Alabama in the class of 2018. When they got Kira Lewis, he's flipped, is now going to Baylor. There were some rumors that he wasn't going to be cleared to play medically at Alabama, so it's kind of weird. Baylor taking Butler, who maybe or maybe not was not cleared to play. Makai Mason, who's missed the past 2 years. Those are their two kind of surefire point guards, and now Lindsey's out for the season. And maybe a guy like Devin Bandu, who's like a combo guard from a JUCO school. Maybe he steps in and provides some stability there.
Yeah, the Butler add is certainly big, especially with Lindsey's injury. It's big long term though, and Baylor's not a school that can necessarily go into big crowds and land top recruits. So to land a 4-star, even though it might have come in a kind of a weird situation due to an injury, is always good. They've done a good job with transfers like Maceo Teague, Davion Mitchell. So I think the backcourt looks really good for the future for Baylor. I'm still more in the camp that this is a rebuild year, especially with Lindsey, where they're more of an NIT club than an NCAA tournament team. I know some people that I've communicated with, like Tony Patelis, are pretty big on Baylor. They might be an interesting team to do a preview on at some point, Brad. But definitely a tough loss to lose a veteran like Lindsey, who's so stable and solid at the guard spot, especially with a lot of moving parts on this Baylor squad.
Yeah, I also had them 8th in the Big 12, and therefore as like a 3 or 4 seed in the NIT. I mean, like Mario Kegler is kind of an underrated addition for them. They could get like a nice jump in production from sophomores like Tristan Clark and Mark Vital. I just think overall this is trending more toward like a rebuilding year, and it is interesting in terms of Baylor landing top recruits, because there was a period in time where they were getting tons of top recruits. Guys like Perry Jones, Quincy Miller, Rico Gathers were all kind of like either 5 stars or like very very highly rated 4 stars, and now they've kind of turned to getting these very good transfers or kind of developing guys. So it's kind of interesting to see a coach do such a heel turn like that in terms of the players that he's landing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's tough to land those guys. And, I think, I'm not going to speculate as to how they were landing Rico Gathers and guys like that who are high level recruits. But I think there's just so much of a crowd now that for these second and third tier power conference schools, the best way of going about it is landing these transfers, especially these up transfers, or maybe even like a guy like Mitchell, where they come from like a similar level of program, but they were kind of blocked at their position because of a development of one player or another. So I think that's kind of a good path right now for Baylor to continue on. And Coach Drew does an outstanding job there. One more little news bite that we wanted to touch on. Jake Huerter officially will not play for Xavier in 2018-19. We didn't expect him to be in the rotation in our Xavier deep dive preview. But he was a 2018 signee, a 7-footer, 3-star, who became embroiled in an undisclosed legal matter before he turned 18. So there's no details of it to be disclosed to the public. He planned to enroll at Xavier, but that obviously has not occurred. And so hard to say what will happen, whether there seems to be the door open for him to enroll in the future, maybe in a year, or maybe he'll have to go the JUCO route or another program. Certainly don't want to speculate on what the legal matter may be, but it seems that Xavier was unable to take Huerter for some reason. It feels like every year Xavier has a late departure too. And last year they had Jared Ritter leave. That weird kind of trend for a program like Xavier that kind of comes off as a very clean, quote unquote, do things the right way type program.
They also had Kentravius Jones, who never made it to campus last year too. He's not going to be a freshman at Oklahoma State. But luckily for their 2019 class, they added Daniel Ramsey last week, who'll play some 4, some 5, probably more 5. He's like an athletic big man. And then earlier today, they got a commitment from Zach Fremantle, who, according to recruiting analysts, when they update the rankings, will be in the top 100. He's kind of like a physical kind of rebounder, kind of post scorer type. Maybe like Ethan Happ without like the passing and like the super high IQ, but that kind of offensive game kind of resembles Ethan Happ. He's not a shot blocker, but the two 2019 recruits, Ramsey and Fremantle, plus Tyreek Jones, who will be a senior, will likely make up Xavier's future front court.
Yeah, I was a big fan of Fremantle, one of those big stock risers in the month of July. Just played super hard, and I know Northwestern really wanted him, so I was really monitoring him, and I thought I was a little surprised that he popped to Xavier this early. I thought he'd take an official at least to Northwestern, and so a bit disappointing from my perspective, but looking forward to watching his games at Xavier.
And then just lastly, one other thing, another late stock riser popped to Virginia. That's Kadeen Shedrick, who's a 6'10" center. Could use a redshirt year, especially because I just noticed this last night, but Tony Bennett is apparently trying to add like one center or like one big man per class. I mean, if you look at it for this year, they have Salt, who's a senior, then Giacchite, who's a junior, then Huff is a sophomore, and then Francisco Cafaro, who I know a lot of people like based on his U18 play, is a freshman. And then you have Kadeen Shedrick coming in. So it'll be interesting to see next year when Shedrick is there, how Bennett kind of balances minutes between those 4 post players.
Yes, indeed. Shedrick was a guy whose stock rose quite a bit, and I'm interested. He definitely looks like he needs to add weight, but he has a lot of skill at his size. So certainly an interesting prospect to watch. There is one more actually late signee. This will be a 2018 that we will touch on the show a little later, but it kind of brings us in well with Maryland, and I'll touch on Ricky Lindo and the incoming recruits. But he was a late reclass back to 2018 to come to Maryland for 2018, and Maryland is our first deep dive preview. So Brad, take it away.
Okay, so Maryland, kind of a disappointing year. Missed the postseason. They were 19-13 overall, 8-10 in the Big Ten, although they had one of the toughest schedules in the Big Ten, obviously with the unbalanced conference scheduling. Teams' strength of schedule, even in conference, varies so differently. That's why you can't use conference record as a full barometer. But they ended up being 39th in KenPom, even though they missed the NIT and the NCAA tournament. Kind of the big turning point, Justin Jackson, their future NBA draft pick. He was picked in the second round by the Orlando Magic. He was hurt after 11 games, but wasn't really playing well prior to the injury. He was having a down season. A lot of people, myself included, thought he was going to really break through and be like a first-team all Big Ten player and bring Maryland back to the NCAA tournament. That obviously didn't happen. In terms of kind of style of play problems, they had a lot of problems taking care of the ball, and that definitely won't be necessarily fixed this season, playing with fewer shooters and playing with two big men at once, which we're going to get to in a little bit. They had a very strong interior defense, and they shot the ball well, but the turnovers were really the big problem. And they were a very inexperienced team last year, one of the most inexperienced in the country, and they'll be even more inexperienced this season.
Right, and the biggest thing is losing Huerter and Justin Jackson to pro basketball. I don't think the Jackson move was surprising given his preseason stock in terms of like looking forward and recruiting, but Huerter certainly was with the way his stock rose or late in the draft process. So that's the biggest kind of hold up, I think, with most looks at Maryland is losing a guy like Kevin Huerter. How do you balance it with what they bring in? But they do bring in a good amount of talent. So let me bring you through the recruiting class. It's a 6-man freshman recruiting class Cyril Smith is a guard. He is the number 154 player in the class. Kind of a combo scoring guard. I believe he was originally committed to Ole Miss. Then there's another combo guard in there, Eric Ayala, number 78 in the composite. He's a guy who went to IMG Academy. Very strong kid. Played very well with We Are One on the Under Armour circuit last summer. He's a top 100 recruit, and I think a good rotation player throughout his collegiate career. Aaron Wiggins, a 6'6", kind of wing shooter, out of High Point, North Carolina, a fringe top 50 recruit at number 42 in the composite. A guy they're very excited about and had a pretty big trip overseas with Maryland. They just finished up a trip to Italy. Then there's a couple of wings. Trace Ramsey, who is from Don Bosco Prep, fringe top 300 recruit, not necessarily a highly regarded prospect, mostly mid-major offers. Ricky Lindo, who was the late signee, as I said, from Woodrow Wilson in D.C., ranked number 476 in the composite. I don't think that necessarily represents what is his talent and his skill level. I think he would have probably seen some high major offers and continue to see that recruitment rise had he continued into the 2019 class as expected. And finally, the headliner of this class, the big man, Jalen Smith, 6'10", out of Mount St. Joseph High School in Baltimore, Maryland, number 16 in the composite rankings for 24/7, a five-star prospect, nicknamed Sticks, and he is going to form a really interesting front court with Bruno Fernando. And once again, I get stuck with a really large recruiting class. So, Brad, we got to really switch this up at some point.
It's because the most interesting teams are the ones with all the newcomers.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think maybe the biggest takeaway, like the first thing that I noticed when looking at this Maryland team is kind of their bench is very inexperienced. I mean, their bench is 4 freshmen and then Ivan Bender, who didn't play from December on last season due to injury. He also missed a full season in his career due to injury. I don't think he's like the same player as he once was. So he's kind of their first big off the bench. And then Josh Tamayak, who was a redshirt freshman last year, joined the rotation once Justin Jackson went down. Hit 7 of 15 from 3, but that's obviously a very small sample size. Those are the only 2 returning players coming off the bench. From the limited I've seen of Ricky Lindo, Ricky Lindo, excuse me. I've seen a lot of Ricky Lindo, but Ricky Lindo kind of reminds me of a Jamarco Pickett, who plays for Georgetown this year. He's kind of like a stretch 4/3, kind of a 6'8". He can shoot. He could be an interesting piece. Maybe he could play some off the bench, especially because Maryland's going to need some 3-point shooting. And then I think Smith and Eric Ayala are very important recruits in terms of adding more shooting and scoring. Looks like Ayala was probably the best reserve. And being like a top 80 recruit for a team that has NCAA tournament aspirations, that's not usually good enough. In terms of like your 6th man off the bench, like you want someone usually a little more experienced in that spot.
I will say it's very interesting. I expected Ayala to be one of the guys who put up, very good numbers on this European trip, but from what I've found, I mean, Ayala was definitely a rotation piece. But it seems like actually Cyril Smith was the guy who really provided the scoring punch in that 6-man type role. I know John Rothstein has tweeted a couple of times about Smith potentially being a rotation type player. He had, I think, like 15 points in one game, 10 in another. They were playing games that were close enough where they were competitive throughout in like the 15 to 25 point range, where Maryland kept teams at arm's length the entire time, but wasn't just beating them by 70 or 80 the way that I know there was like Notre Dame played a game in the Bahamas. They won like 116 to 34. So it'll be really interesting to see whether both guys can find rotation minutes. I think they're both a little different players, but it seems like Smith has asserted himself as a guy who can really provide that scoring punch off the bench. Presumably, the starting lineup is pretty easy to project, Brad. I mean, I think you'd agree that it'll be Anthony Cowan at the 1, Aaron Wiggins and Daryl Morcell sharing the 2 and the 3, depending on how you want to classify it. Morcell, the smaller guy, but definitely more of a 3 in terms of the way he plays. and then Bruno Fernando and Jalen Smith sharing the front court. I think that's like a pretty like, clear front top 5 starting rotation for them.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think having if a Herter had returned, and then you could bring like an Aaron Wiggins off the bench, like now we're really talking like in terms of a good team. I mean, you have a second proven scorer next to Anthony Cowan. You got this great big man in Bruno Fernando, and you have a guy in Jalen Smith who can play the 4 and the 5. He can put the ball on the floor. He's athletic. He blocks shots. Now we're talking about like a nice cohesive, well balanced rotation. But it just seems like this team is missing something, and I think that they are. That's Herter, because when recruiting Herter, you would never have thought that he was going to be a 2 and done player. So I think the kind of imbalance in the roster and kind of getting these 3 late commitments, or like spring commitments with Smith, Lindo, and Ramsey, kind of shows that Coach Turgeon kind of felt that this team was also missing something, and kind of was grasping late there.
When they were in on a lot of transfers, and they made a lot of sense to grab one, but you could almost feel this necessity for Mark Turgeon to land an immediate impact player in terms of anything to give this guy, give this team a little extra oomph, especially with Herter gone. Where I don't know the details as to why they missed on transfers like Zane Martin, who is from pretty close by in Philly, and took a visit after leaving Towson. I don't know if this was a Mark Turgeon felt he needed immediate help instead of a long-term piece. But it is something that you do experience, especially when you're dealing with a coach who may be staring down a hot seat. And I'm sure we'll touch on that a little bit later in our preview of this Maryland club. But how do you balance that? Oh, we can get a Trace Ramsey who can play this year, or a Ricky Lindo who can play this year. But the likelihood that his impact throughout his 4-year career is near the level of a Zane Martin for 2 years on a sit 1 play 2, to me doesn't stack up. Now, I don't know who backed off first on Zane Martin. They were involved with several transfers. So he's just one example. But I do think that's like one of those interesting storylines to always watch with a team that enters like a tipping point type of season.
Yeah, and I think I definitely don't agree with the Mark Turgeon should be fired talk. If you look, last year was obviously a disappointment, but I mean, Justin Jackson, who was probably their second best player, was hurt. So that's like a reasonable excuse. The previous 3 years, they won at least 24 games. They went 24-9, and then 27-9 the year before, and 28-7 the year before that, including one Sweet 16. In 16-17, they lost to Xavier in the first round. Xavier ended up making the Elite Eight. So it's not, this is like a very strong kind of resume. I know the first 3 years there didn't go as anticipated, but like, why would you necessarily care about that when you just had 3 really good years in a row, when you were at the top of the Big Ten, you're rolling, like you're making NCAA tournaments, recruiting's going well, you have a strong class this year. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense as to why Maryland would feel that he's underachieved that much.
I think the biggest thing is they just haven't had that big NCAA tournament run. They had the one Sweet 16, but for the most part, it's felt like they've really underachieved a little bit. The end of the era of Melo Trimble was sort of unceremonious. I think a lot of people expected more from him. So it's one of those where, like, if Maryland, when they had all those pieces together, had made the Final Four, even if they didn't deserve it, everybody would be singing Mark Turgeon's praises still. But because they really haven't like taken that next step into like having an elite year, you start to say, well, is he really the guy? And he's also one of those frustrating coaches who generally at Maryland has underachieved his talent level. Like the year they had Diamond Stone, Robert Carter, Melo Trimble, like they had the talent to be so much more than what they were. And so I think that's the main frustration with Maryland. And whenever you follow up a coach like Gary Williams, you're always going to face an incredible amount of scrutiny, perhaps more than is deserved.
Yeah, I don't agree at all with evaluating someone based on NCAA tournament, like making a big run, because there's just so much variance involved. Like even the year that Maryland made the Sweet 16, didn't Cal lost Tyrone Wallace and someone else to injury, so like they were banged up and they lost like Hawaii, and then Maryland got to Sweet 16 by playing 2 double-digit seeds. So I mean, there's just so much variance, both positively and negatively, that making a decision based on like tournament success, it just feels a little short-sighted, because I mean, look at what people were saying about Jay Wright's ability to coach in the NCAA tournament, and then he's won two championships since. People say Bill Self isn't a good coach because he can't make the Final Four, lose it in the Elite Eight, and I mean he made the Final Four this year. I mean he's won a national championship too. The bars, like the expectations always get raised like the better you do, and so when you raise the bar and then fire the coach who set the higher bar for not reaching the new higher bar, and like you bring someone else in and expect them to just magically do better in a single elimination tournament, just seems crazy to me.
Yeah, I think that's super fair, and I'm personally not like all over the Mark Turgeon should be fired bandwagon. I think you don't often get a chance to miss the NCAA tournament 2 years in a row at a program like Maryland and keep your job, and so that's kind of what he's staring down this year. And obviously, there's a immense amount of pressure being the head coach at Maryland. It's a big program with a lot of expectations. It's a basketball school. They've had the Big Ten move, which is obviously changed a lot of people's kind of view of the program. But it's so tough for me to say what Maryland should do with Mark Turgeon. I know that they're really in their entire athletic department has been in flux for a little bit. Now they're dealing with DJ Durkin stuff on the college football side. Everything will factor in, and I don't know how we can say necessarily what they should be looking at long term. I think the best thing we can do is kind of look at what they have this season, and I'm a little interested by your kind of general downness on Maryland, because to me, yes, they'll be young, but they have recruits who are in a level where they should at least be able to contribute. Now, the depth may not be there, but I really like the way this team is built, where you have Jalen Smith and Bruno Fernando up front, both of whom very long, both of whom have a chance to block some shots, especially Fernando. Smith is able to shoot the basketball. I think he pairs pretty well with Fernando, who has the talent to be one of the bigger breakout players in college basketball, certainly showed signs last season. Then you have Daryl Morcell, who is a very good rotation player in the Big Ten last season. Actually made 4 threes in a game in their international trip. Now, obviously, we always take these stats with a grain of salt, but at the same time, making 4 threes, given how badly Daryl Morcell shot the ball last season, is a massive step forward for him. And then you have Aaron Wiggins, who shot the ball extremely well at 46% from 3 in the Under Armour circuit. And then Anthony Cowan, an experienced point guard. Now he turns it over. He's certainly not a perfect player, and putting the ball in the hands of Morcell and Wiggins instead of a guy like Huerter, who was very steady with the ball, is a bit of a concern for me. But I think the spacing with this team should be pretty good. Jalen Smith showed some ability to hit threes, especially at the end of his EYBL tenure. Morcell, if he can just become competent, you can space teams out pretty good. Have a athletic rim runner in Fernando, experienced point guard. If you can get some bench production from some of the younger guys like Ayala and Smith, and then up front with guys like Tumaik and Bender, I feel pretty good about projecting this team at least to be in the NCAA tournament conversation.
Yeah, so I think the main reason why I'm down on them, I don't like. So I mean, you mentioned with Morcell how he hit 4 threes overseas, but I don't think that we can take any stats from overseas trip with any validity. I mean, we have guys who score like 30 points in a game. Like I know, for those who don't know, I'm a Providence fan, so the Providence stuff comes to mind first for me. I remember Junior Lamamba had 32 points in his overseas trip when the Friars went to Italy. I don't even think he scored 30 points in that entire season. That was his sophomore year, and he was their leading scorer on the trip. He was hitting jump shots. He shot like in the teens in terms of a percentage from a 3-point range. Just the kind of vast jump in a competition between Division I and these foreign trips. I don't necessarily trust any of those stats, but more so was 3 of 25 from 3-point range last year, and this was a team that already kind of struggled with turnovers and kind of floor spacing, even though they had one of the best shooters in the country in Kevin Huerter. Now you bring in a guy like Wiggins, who maybe when he's an upperclassman he'll be as good of a shooter, but typically freshmen, even ones that are billed as really good shooters, can struggle in terms of shooting the ball. There are certainly cases like Huerter, who shot the ball well as a freshman, like a Marcus Howard, who shot like 50-something% from three as a freshman. But there are even more cases. I know this. I mentioned the Providence stuff comes to mind, but Jalen Lindsey, when he was a freshman, sophomore, shot in the high 20s from three. When he was a junior, shot in like the mid 40s from three, and he was someone who was billed as a shooter coming in. I know same with like Bryce Cotton. Bryce Cotton is another example of that. So I think that the shooting could still be a concern. Certainly, the shooting looks to be worse than it was last season. And then playing the two bigs, Smith and Fernando, I think both are probably better as five, and you're going to play them together, which kind of limits not only your floor spacing, but guys who can create. And when turnover is already a problem, and then you're shrinking the floor, I think that this has a chance to be a really kind of ugly offensive unit. I know some of the bench players like Cyril Smith and Eric Ayala can score as well, but do you want Wiggins playing like a small ball four? Like, can he do that as a freshman? So I think that there's a lot of offensive questions here.
Yeah, I think the best kind of small ball four is really Daryl Morcell. It's just this big physical like fourth guard where you could play maybe like Cowan, Ayala, Wiggins. So like three of your guards are of good size in that 6'4" to 6'6" range. Ayala and Morcell with pretty strong bodies. Wiggins a little bit skinnier. I think if you're going to play small, that's probably the way to do it. But they don't really have that swingman other than a guy like Lindo or Trace Ramsey, which I don't think I expect to find significant rotation minutes. It's possible one does at least carve out a spot, given they only have 11 scholarship players on the roster by my count. But they did lose Schneider Herard, which doesn't seem like a massive loss, but would have been a midseason eligible big man. And given I'm not necessarily the highest on Josh Tamaik, just because I've watched him a lot with Spain, and just he's never really shown off why he's a Maryland basketball player to me. He's never really shown the high major level talent overseas, at least, and didn't really get too much of a chance to see him really when he broke out last season, if you will, because Maryland wasn't very good and I wasn't watching a ton of Maryland. So just I like some of the possibilities. I don't love they don't really have a lot of versatile pieces. They don't have a lot of those combo 2-3-4s that can let you play big or small, which is a big thing I like in evaluating a team. But I think there's enough of a core here for me to be at least confident they can contend in the Big Ten in terms of contending for a bid. I mean, they weren't that far off last season. They went 8-10, and obviously they lose Huerter. But they went 8-10. They played a lot of close games. They could have won a lot more than they did. They just couldn't get the job done, and a lot of times down the stretch. And I think a year older Anthony Cowan will be a good thing. Cowan's a really polarizing player in college basketball. I'm interested to know your thoughts on him as a whole.
Yeah, a lot of these kind of sophomore or junior point guards who average around 15 points a game, it's kind of difficult to differentiate where I would stack him. So I'm making a top 35 point guard article, and Cowan's in there, but I've had a really hard time kind of comparing all right, who's better, Peyton Pritchard or Anthony Cowan, or Jalen Adams, or either of those two, or even bringing in some the bigger mid-major guys like DeMarcus Simons or John Elmore. I think it's really tough to kind of compare these guys who are the leaders of their team and put up all these stats in terms of points and assists and can all shoot. So I think Cowan, I think I have him roughly as the 20th best point guard in college basketball. Yeah, I think he's probably this team's best player. I liked what I saw from Bruno Fernando in the NBA Combine, but he still kind of seems more prospect than a player. In terms of he flashes all the skills, but he doesn't really seem to me like someone who's going to come out and dominate. in college. He had some really strong performances early in the season and kind of petered off toward the end, or maybe that was just Maryland being super relevant at the beginning and then not so much at the end. But I think the Cowan and Fernando Tucson is very good. I'm just very concerned about kind of the youth around it and the lack of shooting and this kind of at least on paper a weak bench.
Yeah, so where would you stack them up right now in the Big Ten? I know we've touched the length pretty much every time we've talked about the Big Ten, that there's a couple teams at the top that are fairly clearly very good, and then a massive glut of teams that we should at least expect to be in some sort of NCAA tournament conversation. Whether we put them in preseason is another story, but there's really like a 10-team tier, and I think Maryland certainly sits in that. But we're kind of in that middle group. Do you see them?
So I have Maryland finishing in 9th. So I have them one behind Minnesota, one ahead of Penn State. And then nationally, that puts them in like the early 70s, which makes them like a 4 or 5 seed in the NIT.
Yeah, I would say I'm a little bit higher than you. I don't have like a full Big Ten rankings that I've done. I think I'd put them definitely above Rutgers, above Iowa, above Illinois. I think I'd have them above Minnesota preseason. I think I'd have them above Northwestern preseason. I'd have them above Penn State preseason. And I might put them above Nebraska preseason.
What about Ohio State?
I think I'll bet on Chris Holtmann and take Ohio State over them. But talent-wise, I think I would take Maryland's roster in a vacuum over Ohio State's.
And then what about Purdue?
I think I'll take Purdue right now.
All right, so you have them at 6 then?
Yeah, that's kind of where that's pretty much right now. I think I would have them 6 or 7.
You have them 7.
6, 7, 8 was kind of like in my head where I was seeing them.
And then nationally, where do you have them?
Nationally, I would have them like a top 2 seed in the NIT, maybe a top 3 seed.
Okay,
so not in the tournament, but just outside.
I feel like most people have them in the tournament. That's why I've been so vocal about being down on them. And in fact, 2 people have them in their too early top 25, which is absolutely mind-blowing to me. The first one being Barstool Reeves has them at 25. That's insane. And then number 23 would be Gary Parrish. Still, I mean, like how can you even rationalize that like this Maryland team is better than like a Clemson or a West Virginia or TCU or Oregon or like even like a Wisconsin or Marquette, like I don't see those teams even like remotely comparable.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I don't see how you can see this as a top 25 team right now, given how much there's so many leaps you have to make. Like the talent on this team's, like I don't think it would be like out of the question for them to wind up a top 25 team. Like I wouldn't like completely rule it out, but at the same time, like the amount of leaps you're making, you're making the leap that like Aaron Wiggins will be a good Big Ten starter right away and shoot the ball well. You're making the leap that like Jalen Smith will be a good Big Ten starter right away. You're making the leap that Bruno Fernando takes a massive step and Daryl Morcell steps forward and Anthony Cowan takes care of the ball without a secondary ball handler as good as Kevin Huerter. You're making the leap that this bench will produce. Like if everything goes right, like I think their best scenario outcome is pretty good. Like almost, I might even go as far as say very good. But I don't know that I would I would say that it's at all a realistic projection at this point.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that needs to go right. It kind of reminds me of Louisville from maybe 2 seasons ago, where they lost like Damian Lee and Trey Lewis. They lost all these guys. They had Quinn Snyder, and then they had like the people who had them in the top 25 were basically saying, Donovan Mitchell, Deng Adele, and Ray Spalding are all going to make these like massive leaps. And really, Spalding didn't really make a, and that kind of vaulted Louisville to be like a 2 or 3 seed. I don't think that this Maryland team has the same level of talent as that Louisville team, but it's like the same sort of principle where you're just betting on like everyone making like such a big improvement. that it feels unlikely, but I'm not going to sit here and say that it's impossible that like Maryland could make the top 25. But in terms of being willing to put them in your top 25, it's just like a wildly optimistic kind of prediction based on the other teams in that area.
Yeah, I completely agree. We'll do our quick sum up of where we stand on coaches. I know we did a lot with Mark Turgeon already, but I do want to just kind of sum it up. Do you think he has a job if this team doesn't make the NCAA tournament?
Well, given that I have them 73rd overall, 9th in the Big Ten, and a 5 seed in the NIT, then he's gone.
Yeah, I think that would if it falls to like the bottom tier of the Big Ten and like a very like no chance NCAA tournament team, then yeah, I don't think he survives it. Quickly,
a 5 seed NIT team is usually in the bubble, like on the bubble until like the last week of the regular season.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, kind of like Mississippi State last year. It's like, oh, if they win like 2 games in the SEC tournament and they in one of those games over Kentucky, then maybe they'll have a shot. So I think they'll be in like a decent spot, but ultimately, yeah, I'll fall short.
And a quick glance at their non-conference schedule. It's a pretty easy start. They don't leave the state of Maryland all non-conference season. Start with Delaware, then a trip to Annapolis to play Navy in like one of those in that yearly game at the Naval Academy. North Carolina A&T should be a pushover. Hofstra at home, a pretty good CAA club. Mount St. Mary's in a rebuild this year without Jamie and Christian. Marshall, a good Conference USA club. Then they get Virginia at home right after Thanksgiving. They should probably lose that game, even though it's a tough place to play. They have Loyola on a neutral floor, but it's Baltimore, so it might as well be a home game for Maryland. Then Loyola, Maryland, the next game, also at Xfinity Center. They also round out that non-conference schedule with Seton Hall and Radford. It's not a ton of opportunity there. I don't necessarily expect them to win any of the games. The only game they probably won't be favored in would be that Virginia game and possibly the Seton Hall game. I think at home they should be favored against them and Loyola Chicago, who are probably the 2 other big tests on the schedule. But a chance for them to rack up wins and find their stride early if all goes right.
Are they not in a in-season tournament?
I don't believe so. No.
That's tough because Virginia is the only surefire NCAA tournament team. I mean, Seton Hall, I have them as a bubble team, and I'm higher than most, it seems, on Seton Hall. Mm-hmm. Then I have Loyola kind of in a similar range to Maryland in that kind of late 60s, early 70s in terms of the national ranking. And I'm lower than most on Loyola. So that's, I mean, even if you think that Loyola is like a top 50 team, that's still not enough opportunities for Maryland to really make a dent in the non-conference.
But although because they do play a 20-game now Big Ten schedule, there is a little bit more opportunity in terms of building resumes. Next up, I think that's all we have on Maryland, correct, Brad? Next up, Syracuse. Brad, take it away with them.
Okay, so Syracuse ended the season at 41st in KenPom. Obviously, they were the last addition to the NCAA tournament. People were yelling from the rooftops how they don't deserve it. We want to see Middle Tennessee. We don't want to see Syracuse. Syracuse stinks. Syracuse comes out, wins 3 straight postseason games, beating Arizona State in the playing game, and then TCU and Michigan State before losing to Duke in the Sweet 16. So they finished at 23-14 overall, 8-10 in the ACC. They had an elite defense, 5th overall, led by Pascal Chukwu, the 7'2" rim protector, who is a very strong defender. He's unbelievable at contesting shots and kind of controlling the paint there. And they were great at both defending the 3 and the 2 with all the length they had on the perimeter. Guys like Tyus Battle and Frank Howard are 6'4", 6'5", and then the wings with Dolzaj and Brissett are like 6'7", 6'8", and then obviously Chukwu in the back. They blocked a lot of shots. They created turnovers. They got on the offensive glass, but the offense was very, very ugly. They just could not score, and they played really slow, which is a product of having so few creators. They had Battle and Frank Howard kind of playing a lot of isolation, being required to create most of the offense and settling with kind of contested end of the shot clock shots. They were last in terms of bench usage, and they were in like the bottom 30 in terms of minutes continuity from the year before and experience. Starting two freshmen and then a sophomore in Tyus Battle. They did not shoot the ball from three very well at all. O'Shea Brissett was their best 3-point shooter at 33%. But hopefully the improved depth and improved kind of creation ability that's going to come with adding a Jalen Carey and Elijah Hughes, just giving them more capable players to turn to should make this offense better. Now, how much better, I'm not sure, but I think this is certainly a more well balanced club. Their only losses from last year are Matthew Moyer, who quite frankly was just not very good at all. He was a former top 50 recruit who's now off to Vanderbilt. And then Geno Thorpe, who left after 6 games. I thought he was going to have a nice role as like a 6th-man scoring type. They could have used some of his creation, even though he seemed to be in Jim Boeheim's doghouse early in the season.
And finally, we get a team that's almost entirely running it back. So I don't have as many recruits to touch on, although there is 1 transfer coming in and 3 freshmen. That transfer, as you mentioned, was Elijah Hughes. Comes in off of a freshman season at East Carolina in which he was solid but not spectacular. His recruiting interest after transferring was mostly of the mid-major variety, but Hughes was sold by Syracuse on being much more of a creator than the mid-major teams were seeing him as. Where mid-majors saw him as kind of like that combo wing, playing like the 2 or the 3 who could really score the ball at 3 levels. Syracuse pitched him on playing some point guard, from my understanding, is what they pitched him on. Now, I don't know how much that recruiting will hold true for Syracuse, but he'll certainly have an opportunity to handle the ball. He's 6'6", 220 pounds, averaged about 8 points, 2 rebounds, and 1 assist in 20 minutes a game at East Carolina, but only shot about 35% from the field. Had a couple of really big breakout type performances, especially late in the season. His conference tournament against Temple and SMU, respectively, 17 and 15 points, shooting, making 4 of 6 from 3 in those 2 games combined. So showed the ability to shoot the ball in those 2 games. I think that definitely helped propel his recruiting interest. Also, the 3 freshmen, Jalen Carey, 61 of the 24/7 composite, 6'3" guard who can play either the 1 or the 2, really score the basketball. Didn't have really impressive assist numbers on the EYBL circuit, which is one of the main reasons I've kind of debunked this idea that Jalen Carey fixes their offense, but certainly a good get. Then Robert Braswell, a late stock riser, who is mostly looking at like A10 level programs. I know Butler was involved, UMass, and then finally got a Syracuse offer. He's a fringe top 150 recruit in the final update of the composite. 6'9", but very skinny. Definitely looks like a piece who could factor in long term as a piece in the zone, but not necessarily a guy who I would expect to make a big immediate impact. And then finally, Buddy Boeheim, son of Jim, 6'5", very good shooter, earned his Syracuse offer, although he is actually walking onto the team to my knowledge. He can 6'5", really shoots the ball well, was very good for the City Rocks last summer, and so that is very much like an ACC like mid-level recruit at 347 in the composite. That's usually for more like mid-major players, but he got an offer from, I believe, Gonzaga, a couple of other interesting pieces and interesting programs. So Boeheim, not just a pushover end of the bench player, he will be a rotation player throughout his college career.
Yeah, so I think the kind of main thing to kind of discuss is how or if Syracuse will fix their offense. And I think, just even adding guys like Hughes and Carey, even if they don't necessarily live up to kind of the expectations that like many have put on them, including Syracuse fans, but like Carey, he can score, he can create, and he can shoot the ball. Hughes can score a little bit. He averaged almost 8 points a game as a freshman in the AAC. But last season, Syracuse really only had 2 guys that could handle the ball in Howard and Battle. I mean, O'Shea Brissett could straight line drive, but they were using two guys with either Chuku and Moyer or Chuku and Dolezaj that didn't even want to look at the basket. I mean, Dolezaj played a lot better toward the end of the season, especially in their postseason run. But he was like a kind of glue guy who would like make hustle plays and stuff. He's a good player, but he was not a very aggressive offensive player, and he was not a floor spacer. So just getting other guys that are going to be aggressive and the defense has to kind of account for, and they can hit a shot. I think that's just going to free up this Syracuse offense so much, even if Hughes and Carey have noticeable deficiencies in their games.
Right, and I think that is the biggest thing with Carey and with Hughes is it's just more ball handling. It's more guys who can create off the bounce, more guys who can do stuff late in the shot clock. This Syracuse team last season often was Frank Howard, Tyus Battle, and O'Shea Brissett hanging around on the perimeter until the shot clock went down to like 6, and then Tyus Battle chucking up a contested shot, or O'Shea Brissett chucking up a contested shot, or even Frank Howard chucking up a contested shot. They all shot under 40% from the field, and that's been my kind of biggest thing is like, how do you, if you're a team that wants to be a top 25 team, you can't have as bad an offense as Syracuse had. You have to make exponential strides to go from bubble team to top 25 team, in my opinion. And with Syracuse, I'm not entirely sold that they make those exponential shots. Sure, Jalen Carey helps. He's an improvement of a guy who can really score the basketball. Sure, Elijah Hughes helps. He's a guy who can defend. He'll fit in the zone well. He can score the ball a little bit. Even a guy like Buddy Boeheim just helps as a spacer if he winds up getting rotation minutes. But it's still, to me, there's no one player that exponentially changes how this offense looks, which is my reason for my pessimism is I think I really like the idea that they could potentially go with some smaller ball and play Jalen Carey at the 1, Frank Howard at the 2, Tyus Battle at the 3, O'Shea Brissett at the 4, and then Pascal Chukwu at the 5. That allows you to space out a little bit more. That allows you to get O'Shea Brissett more in some attacking looks. Hughes is also useful in small ball lineups as like a 2 or a 3, bigger ball handler. So I like the opportunities that these open up. I don't know that it's enough to make that exponential jump. I think it's enough to make them a clear NCAA tournament team, more in like that 9 seed type range where they're more safely in the field. I don't think it's enough to go into like a top 6 seed, which is where I think most people would project the Syracuse club at this point.
So I don't necessarily think that they need to make an exponential jump in terms of like their individual games. I think like the exponential jump in terms of the team's offense is going to come a lot from having like this additional depth where, they were literally last in terms of like bench usage. And what that does is both in terms of your players are so heavily relied upon and are getting tired, but also you kind of have this mentality where you have this ultimate green light and you can kind of take shots without the fear of being pulled. So I think just getting more competent players in there will not only ensure that the players are more fresh so they don't have to play so slow and kind of settle for contested shots, but they're also kind of have the incentive to work for a good shot where they could get pulled and not have to turn to guys like a Matthew Moyer or a Howard Washington who weren't really ACC level players as freshmen last year. You can turn to guys who are more talented, and I think the reason why they could be like an average offensive team and still be like a top 25 team is because this defense is just so good. In terms of having all this length to contest jump shots and then all the length in the paint with Pascal Chukwu to kind of protect the rim, and guys like O'Shea Brissett, had showed a lot of flashes last year, and then Dolezaj with his play toward the end of the season. I think both those guys could make a jump, and then having like such a strong top 3 of your bench there with Hughes, Carey, and then CBB who could spell Chukwu. I think that there's a lot of versatility here. I think that the improved depth doesn't really compromise your defense, and then the offense should be better as well.
Yes, I think those are all pretty fair points, and I don't think it's at all crazy to suggest they'll be a top 25 team. I'm not there yet. I I do also want to point out there's one potential midseason ad that Syracuse could bring in. I just remember this actually. Quincy Guerrier, I believe is how it's pronounced. He's from Canada, 6'8", combo forward. He's planning to enroll mid-year, a 2019 recruit, a top 50 guy. Has considering also programs such as Minnesota, Oregon, Virginia Tech, Maryland, etc. And so that's a guy who they could add and just continue to add to that defense and continue to add that depth. I wouldn't expect a guy like that to fill rotation minutes right away, especially given the fact that the zone is a little bit more of an adjustment for guys who have never played in college before. So I wouldn't necessarily expect him to be an instant impact guy, but if he were to be midseason, that would only boost this team's roster even more.
I think that Guerrier plans to redshirt that half year. I'm not 100% sure on that, but that's what I thought I read. But I mean, he would be such a perfect fit in that Syracuse zone with his size and his shooting ability, especially if and when they lose Tyus Battle to the NBA after this season. He could be a nice fill-in in that rotation. In terms of where they stand in the composite, so only two people have Syracuse outside the top 25. That is Kevin Sweeney, and that is Barstool Reegs. Looks like the highest someone has them is 10th, which I think that's kind of wild. That's very optimistic there to have them, potentially over teams like Villanova. Yeah. This is Kyle Kensing from Athlon, has Syracuse ahead of Villanova, has them ahead of Virginia Tech and Kansas State and Auburn and Kentucky. He has Kentucky at 15. So maybe his should get thrown out. I mean, that's kind of a wild ballot right there. But then in terms of where Syracuse stands overall, they come in at 20th in terms of the composite, one ahead of UCLA and one behind Michigan.
Yeah, that's like not an at all unreasonable projection. I don't hate that projection by any means. I think I don't want to be the guy who's just like gonna just pound his chest and say like I'm right here and like I'm not gonna budge on this team, because I very well may budge pretty early on the Syracuse team. I'm not as down as people think. I'm not a hater. I don't really understand where that narrative comes from. I've just kind of I've really backed myself into this idea that like the Syracuse offense can't be good enough to be a top 25 team, and now that may not be true. I just don't. There's just so many questions for me about like, does O'Shea Brissett become that much more efficient? Like I think there's just there's significant improvements that need to be made by each person's efficiency, which is more to me than just we were tired because we played all game, that need to be showed to me before I fully jump on the Syracuse as a top 25 team bandwagon. I'm not as down on them as I feel like people are portraying me to be.
Yeah, I mean, even like me with Maryland. I mean, if like the first game I watch them and they they're playing really well, I'm not gonna like if I watch them during the season and they're playing well and they're like 8-1 or whatever through 9 games, I'm not gonna be like holding on to this idea that I have them 73rd. I mean, if I see them and they're playing well, I'm gonna kind of change my evaluation. Like I'm gonna use what data I have available, what like information I have available to make the decision. I'm not just gonna hold on to my preseason perception.
Yeah, I think there's way too many people who just hold on to that, like that perception for as long as they can, when it's just not. It's not realistic at all. It's people are made more worried about like being right than they are about like being a good like doing like a legit projection.
Yeah, I mean, no one really cares if you're right at the end of the day. No, no one even remembers if you're wrong unless you're like really wrong.
Right, you have to like really pound your chest on one for a really long time for them to know you're wrong, and they don't remember if you're right unless you project Virginia to be like the number 1 team in the country, and that happens.
Yeah. And then, so in terms of the rotation for Syracuse, who do you have? Whether it be your top 8 or your top 9, I think Boeheim usually leans shorter, right?
Yeah, I would say so. I think the 8 is pretty clear to me. It's Carey, Howard, Hughes, Battle, Brissett, Dolajai, Sidibe, Chukwu. and then either Howard Washington, Buddy Boeheim, or Robert Braswell seals that last spot. I would lean towards Howard Washington.
Yeah, so I think the top 8 is very clear, and then for that 9th, yeah, I think Howard Washington. It's tough. I don't know if Boeheim's going to play Howard Washington over his own son. I mean, I can see a guy like Hughes or a Carey who are kind of more proven, but a guy like Washington, I think gets the pine for Buddy Boeheim, and then Braswell, I think is more of a long-term piece there.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, even though he is a pretty well-regarded recruit at this point. So yeah, I would agree. I think the rotation is pretty clear. I think we've pretty much outlined our feelings on this team in terms of we both have men's NCAA tournament teams. You're a little higher on them than me. Is there one guy you like really expect to see a jump from in terms of their efficiency or their scoring, like of the 3 guys who were big last year? Or do you think they just kind of both make incremental jumps, and that combined with a little more extra firepower is all they need?
I would say more incremental. The one I'm less enthusiastic about making an efficiency jump would be Frank Howard, just because he's always kind of wild in terms of his decision making. I think that the guy who can make a really big jump, maybe not even in terms of stats, but just in terms of like his impact, would be Dolezaj with how he was playing toward the end of last year. This kind of the glue guy kind of plays that he makes. And then if Chukwu can just become a little more confident, I mean, he's a very, very good player for how flawed he is offensively. He's so valuable just with his length and his shot blocking and shot altering capabilities. That's just such an important piece for them. If he can just become like a little more sure of himself on offense, then Syracuse have a really, really imposing center.
Yeah, it's always like an adventure to watch him play. I mean, he's so fun to watch defensively, but just the offense has always been kind of a shaky point, as I'm sure you've seen over the years.
Well, I mean, he was a good offensive player for his 1 year at Providence. Like, he was hitting free throws, he was hitting kind of mid-range jump shots. He looked confident, and then all of a sudden, he got like poked in the eye and like had eye surgery at Syracuse, and then it was all downhill from there.
He still hits free throws though, which is like super valuable. If you're that big and you can just like make free throws, that's very useful. And I think if I'm Jim Boeheim, I'll take that. If he can just dunk and make free throws, that's like a useful enough offensive player that when you're surrounding him with a Brissett, a Battle, a Frank Howard, a Jalen Carey, even if the efficiency may not be there from that group, there's enough offensive scoring talent that you can feel pretty good about it.
And the Providence used to run lineups for maybe like 4 to 5 minutes a game with Chukwu and Carson DeRozier's in with like two 7-footers. And I mean, he was not out of place offensively. It was on the defensive end where he was kind of getting like pushed around as a freshman and kind of getting bullied there. But it was shocking to see kind of the steps backwards he took in those areas.
Twin Towers, baby, love to see it.
So then where do you have Syracuse in the ACC and then nationally?
So nationally, I would have them in the 25 to 35 range right now. In the ACC, just off the top of my head, I have definitely going to have Duke ahead of them, definitely going to have Virginia, definitely going to have UNC ahead of them. Would probably put them would definitely put Florida State and Virginia Tech above them, and then I would say like Clemson, North Carolina State, Syracuse, but even like that sort of same tier with Virginia Tech and Florida State would be within like the range of outcomes for me. Is like as my projection is like that's like a tier for me. That group in like the 4 to 8 range is where I would see Syracuse.
Yeah, so I'm very high on that top half of the ACC overall, which puts Syracuse in my rankings as 7th in the ACC, but 18th nationally. So I have them behind obviously Duke, Virginia, UNC, and then Florida State, Virginia Tech, and NC State, who I have all in my top 15, and then Syracuse at 7. And I have Clemson at 24, excuse me, and then a huge drop from Clemson at 8 to Notre Dame at 9. We talked about a couple months ago, who I have as like a 1 or 2 seed in the NIT.
Yep. Yeah, the ACC is going to be really fun, and they're going to get Syracuse's biggest problem really recently in ACC play is they just haven't won road games. They found enough offense at the Carrier Dome, but they just haven't been able to win on the road. And I think that's one area where they can really take the next step this year, especially if they're a little bit more competent offensively. It's just to find a way to win road games.
They'll be more experienced. They'll have more shooting and scoring. So hopefully, it will not only look prettier, but it'll be more effective.
Just wanted to pull up their non-conference schedule real quick as it is out as well. They opened the season with Eastern Washington and Morehead State as part of the 2K Classic, like regional games, and then at the Carrier Dome. Then they have 2 at MSG against UConn, and then either Iowa or Oregon. Then they have Colgate, Ohio State in Columbus for the ACC Big Ten Challenge. Cornell at home. Northeastern will be a good team. That'll be a good test. Georgetown at the Carrier Dome. Old Dominion at the Carrier Dome, Buffalo at the Carrier Dome, Arkansas State at the Carrier Dome, and finally St. Bonaventure. So they actually have a good slate of mid-majors that they're playing, especially down that stretch. It wouldn't stun me if they got shocked by Northeastern or Old Dominion or Buffalo or even Bonaventure like they did last year. Buffalo really gave them a good run for their money. I was at that game. There's not a lot of games really for me that will move the needle big time. Ohio State in Columbus has a chance to be a quadrant 1. Oregon on a neutral should be a quadrant 1 if they get Oregon. Obviously, it depends on them potentially. They have to play Iowa, so depending on how that lines up with Syracuse's result against Connecticut, that would be a chance at a quadrant 1. So not a ton of opportunity for like big time wins, but a ton of like Q2 looks.
Yeah, so I actually just wrote an article 2 days ago that was top 5 non-conference games for Syracuse, and I went. 1 being obviously the chance to play Oregon on a neutral, because to be quadrant 1, that's top 50. Oregon will almost assuredly be top 30. And then 2, I went at Ohio State. 3, I went home against Buffalo. Then 4, I went UConn on a neutral. And then 5, I went Georgetown at home. And then that doesn't even mention obviously Northeastern and Old Dominion, who I think could be top 100, depending if Randy Haynes is back for Old Dominion. I've seen conflicting things, whether he was a senior last year or this year. He averaged like double figures for Old Dominion, so he's a very important piece for them to be a top 100. And then Bonaventure is, if they're 9th or 10th in the A10, that'll put them right around that top 100 as well. But totally agree that there's probably only 2 quadrant 1 opportunities. Well, really 1 in Ohio State and then possibly the 2nd with Oregon. But this is a very good schedule for like the RPI and like the metrics, as they're going to play a lot of teams, greater than 150, which improves your metrics.
Right. Even teams like Colgate and who's the other team that I was going to mention? Like Colgate, like Arkansas State should have like solid conference records. That's another big thing with like your RPI is like the record of the teams you play. All those mid majors will have good records. So Syracuse has done a good job of gaming the RPI this season. Finally, as we do with every team, this is kind of fruitless with Syracuse, but where do we stand on Jim Boeheim? I know there's really only like 2 things to debate. It's like how good a coach he is right now, and like how long does he have left before he retires? Kind of what are your thoughts on those 2 little talking points, Brad?
Well, first, I forgot to mention with the Arkansas State versus Syracuse game, it's a battle between former Providence centers Quadri Smith and Pascal Chukwu.
Wow.
Talk about, we have the 7'2", like 220, and then we have like the 6'6", 280-pound center. I actually had a class with Quadri Smith a few years ago too, so that's an interesting nugget for the day. In terms of Jim Boeheim, people think that he's going to see out his son's tenure at Syracuse. I would put 4 or 5 more years, depending if he redshirts at all. So I think he'll be coaching into his 80s.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I'm generally down on Jim Boeheim at this point. Like, I think he's still a very good coach. I don't think he's an elite coach. He's one of those guys who's like an elite resume, but has had like some struggles in terms of like changing the way he coaches, in terms of like embracing some more like spacing concepts offensively. Although he could do that more this year with Brissett getting more time at the 4. I hope so. But the zone always works, man, especially in March Madness. It always seems to play well in short turnarounds and in high pressure games. Definitely a Hall of Famer. Might already be. I'm trying to remember. Either way, certainly, I think the 4 to 5 year time frame is about right for him. And then obviously the question will be who takes over. I know there's Jerry McNamara's there. I don't imagine that Syracuse should be his first head coaching job at the age of, well, he'll be like maybe 40 when Jim Boeheim's career is over at Syracuse. Obviously, Mike Hopkins, he got tired of waiting. He's at Washington now. I wouldn't necessarily expect that. Coach Autry as well, a good guy on the staff. And then obviously the looks of potentially hiring from outside, which would be very interesting in its own right. But that's a little bit ways down the road if we are to believe the current idea that he'll stay for the rest of his son Buddy's career.
I mean, if Washington lives up to their expectation this year, and is a top 2 team in the Pac-12, and then they've recruited well. I mean, maybe Hopkins gets Washington rolling, and then gets to go back to Syracuse, or maybe he's perfectly happy in the Pac-12, probably making a lot of money. I'm not sure his salary at Washington, but I'm guessing it's at least in the $1.5 to $2 million range. And maybe Nate Oates in terms of a geography there.
Nate Oates would be an awesome hire for Syracuse.
Trying to think who else is up there in New York, if there's any.
I mean, like Hopkins is 48 right now, so he would probably be in like a decent age range in 4 to 5 years to take a Syracuse job. So if he gets it rolling, you would think that's the case. Although, who knows really what went on behind the scenes in terms of where bridges burned by him not staying. And he may have said, "I don't want the Syracuse job. I don't want to follow up Jim Boeheim." So I don't know. I mean, definitely he makes the most sense as the coach of Syracuse. Should it all work out the way I expect it to work out at Washington, and of course, should he want that job when it does wind up opening.
And also,
Jim Boeheim want him to have that job because Jim Boeheim will have hiring power in this search, I would imagine.
And then Rob Murphy was a former Syracuse assistant, right? Who's been in Eastern Michigan. He's done fine. I mean, they've been in like the middle of the pack in the MAC. It's probably not good enough to warrant a jump to a top tier program, but I mean, he was on the staff previously. He plays the zone. They've made a couple CITs and CBIs, so
they've always been like that 20-win team, but never like take the next step. They've done a good job of like taking kids who are like former top recruits who didn't for whatever reason that like recruiting fell off the map. Like they took James Thompson, who's gonna be like a top 10 all-time NCAA rebounder once his career's over. They took Andre Rafis this year, who was like a former like top elite recruit, and then was gonna go to TCU, and that fell through. And now he's gonna go to Eastern Michigan. So like, I don't necessarily know that he would ever get that head coaching job, but he's done a decent job at Eastern Michigan now. While we're on the topic,
I think that'll do it for today, right?
Yeah, it should wrap us up. I do want to touch on one quick news and notes that occurred while we were recording the podcast. Anthony Mack is eligible for this season. He got a waiver from the NCAA, transferring into Miami from Wyoming after missing the season with Wyoming due to a concussion. So I don't think Mack is like a huge impact guy right away at that level, but just adds to that backcourt, and I did want to touch on it because by the time we record next week, it'll probably be out of our minds.
Yeah, they needed another wing there because they really only had four perimeter players with Likes, Johnson, Vasilovic, and Miles Wilson. Now Mack kind of adds some balance there.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And Mack is from my area originally, then prepped in New Jersey, so I'm pretty familiar with his game. I just he'll help in the rotation. I wouldn't be like, oh, he's going to be a starter by any means, but I think he'll help out. And I believe that does it for this show. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. This looks like it was one of our longer ones. That's all right. Thanks for sticking it out if you did. We'll be back next week. I believe our plan right now, Brad, is to do the Homer previews where we'll do Providence and Northwestern, get a chance to really sink our teeth into teams and have a more neutral third party take us down a notch when we're too high on a team or talk us off the ledge when we're too low on a team. So that should be a fun one. Maybe we'll throw in like a 5-minute Sienna preview for me as well. We could even throw in like a little Bryant thing for for you because I like the way Jared Grasso's rolling.
I don't know if I could pick any player on Bryant out of a lineup. Especially because they have a football team too. So when you see very tall people around, they can either be a basketball or a football player.
Yeah, no, that definitely checks. The only thing there's so much gear around Northwestern that it's super easy to identify them all. Plus, you watch all the games on TV. Like all the football players always wear like football specific merchandise, so that's super helpful in identifying players. But cool. That wraps us up. Thanks for listening. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in to the CBB Central Podcast as always.